Imagine the richest war hero of medieval France, a man celebrated alongside Joan of Arc, who might have been history's first medieval serial killer, collecting the severed heads of children and kissing their dead lips as they slowly rotted in the shadows of a castle that should have stood for honor and glory. This isn't a scene ripped from a modern true crime series or a dark history documentary on Netflix. It's the grim reality that unfolded inside towering stone walls during the 1430s. A world where power cloaked monsters in the robes of nobility, and where the boundaries between heroism and horror blurred into a single chilling figure named Gilles de Rais. His story is the ultimate paradox. The Marshal of France, commander of armies, savior of cities, who may have transformed into a predator, lurking behind titles and stained glass hunting children with the same ruthless precision he once unleashed on English soldiers. It's a tale soaked in blood and whispered through centuries, haunting historians and conspiracy theorists alike, because every sinister trope we associate with modern serial killers, the trophy-keeping necrophilia, the ritualistic selection of victims based on beauty, the allure of charm used to lure the innocent, and the fascination with tearing open bodies to glimpse what secrets lay inside all of it, played out half a millennium before Jack the Ripper or Ted Bundy ever walked the earth. And what makes it even more terrifying is that Gilles de Rais wasn't skulking in dark alleys. He was adored, untouchable, revered as a noble patron of art and religion, building chapels even as children vanished around his fortresses. For 8 years, peasants' sons and daughters simply disappeared, and no one dared accuse a man draped in titles and wealth. But by the time Gilles de Rais stood trembling on the scaffold in October 1440, he wasn't just another monster facing justice. He was the center of a dark mystery that pulses at the heart of true crime. And dark history, was he truly France's most monstrous child killer, or the victim of a medieval conspiracy powerful enough to erase evidence and rewrite history itself? Drop your theories in the comments below, because what you're about to uncover may change everything you thought you knew about medieval justice. The secrets hidden in castle walls, and the terrifying truth that sometimes the most dangerous monsters don't hide in shadows. They stand in the blazing light, draped in honor, collecting heads like works of art. Long before the rumors of severed heads and castle walls stained with blood, Gilles de Rais was born into a world that seemed gilded by destiny, a child of unimaginable privilege whose cradle was rocked by both power and tragedy, and whose life would one day blur the lines between heroic legend and the darkest chapters of true crime. In 1404, amid the rolling hills and stone fortresses of northwestern France, Gilles entered a realm where his family's estates stretched farther than some entire kingdoms, where the fleur-de-lis banners flew over countless castles, and where the weight of ancient titles promised a future paved with influence, wealth, and the very marrow of medieval nobility. Yet from the earliest days, fate carved deep scars into the boy who would become known to history as the Marshal of France, and perhaps as Europe's first medieval serial killer. When he was only 11, Gilles likely watched his father gored to death in a violent hunting accident, a savage vision of blood and screaming animals, a trauma echoing through stone corridors and searing itself into the mind of a child barely old enough to wield a sword. His mother died not long after, leaving him orphaned and vulnerable at the very moment most children need guidance and love, thrust instead into the hands of his maternal grandfather, Jean de Craon, a man whose name would later haunt court records as the potential architect of Gilles's moral downfall. Jean wasn't interested in raising a chivalrous young nobleman. He cared only for power politics, and using his grandson as a pawn in schemes of wealth and influence, a sinister mentorship that sowed seeds historians still debate as the roots of Gilles's monstrous acts. Even during his teenage years, Gilles radiated a dangerous duality. He was brilliant, speaking fluent Latin, steeped in the literature and culture befitting the high nobility, yet equally consumed by a volcanic temper prone to violent outbursts and utterly convinced that the weak existed solely to serve the strong, a belief hammered into him by Jean de Crayon's ruthless philosophy. By 16, he was already wielding both charm and cruelty like twin blades, traits that would serve him well on medieval battlefields and far more horrifically behind the locked doors of his private chambers. And so, as France bled through the agonies of the 100 Years' War, the boy named Gilles de Montmorency-Laval stood poised to write his name into history as both savior and monster. But what none could know yet was that the flames of war would forge not only a hero beside Joan of Arc, but possibly the dark figure at the center of one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries, a mystery that takes its first terrifying turn in the next chapter of this tale. As the fires of the 100 Years' War raged across France, devouring towns, tearing families apart, and drowning kingdoms in blood and betrayal, Gilles de Rais stepped from the shadowy corridors of noble privilege onto a battlefield that would forever bind his name to both the triumphs and the tragedies of dark history, a stage where destiny paired him with one of the most enigmatic figures ever to haunt the pages of true crime and medieval legends alike, Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orleans. At just 23, Gilles found himself called to serve the Dauphin Charles, the man who would become King Charles VII, during a time when the English gripped vast swaths of French soil, and the morale of an entire nation lay in shambles, seemingly crushed beneath the iron heel of foreign invaders. And then into that hopeless abyss stepped a teenage peasant girl, claiming divine visions. A girl whose voice crackled with heavenly fire, whose presence demanded the attention of hardened soldiers and skeptical nobles alike, and whose destiny was intertwined not only with the fate of France, but with the darker story waiting to unfold around Gilles de Rais. While many laughed or whispered that she was mad, Gilles believed, or at least recognized, an unstoppable force worth following, and was tasked as one of her military protectors charged with keeping this blazing star alive amid the chaos of war. Together, they shattered the English siege of Orleans, a brutal stalemate that had suffocated the city for 6 long months until Joan and Gilles turned the tide in just 4 days, an almost supernatural reversal that transformed despair into hope and recast Gilles from noble heir into a living war legend. Town after town surrendered beneath the thunder of French banners, and Gilles, ever fearless, plunged into the heart of each battle, earning a reputation for reckless courage, for always being where swords clashed the loudest and blood flowed the thickest, until his valor secured him the title of Marshal of France, one of the highest military honors in the kingdom, a meteoric rise that should have sealed his place as a hero of the medieval world. Yet amid the smoke and the sacred banners, something far more sinister may have been brewing in Gilles' soul, because even as he carved a path through English lines, there were whispers that the same violence which made him a hero was stirring darker cravings within him, foreshadowing the unspeakable acts that would one day tie his name to medieval serial killer lore. And as Joan of Arc's own fate spiraled toward betrayal and flame, Gilles de Rais stood at a crossroads, his next steps destined to plunge him from the shining glare of battlefield glory into the shadows of secret scandal and a vortex of cruelty that would soon devour his fortune and stain his legacy, a descent that begins with an obsession for spectacle and excess in the very next chapter of this haunting tale. When the flames that once lit Joan of Arc's path were finally extinguished on the pyre at Rouen, Gilles de Rais returned to his estates no longer the shining sword of France, but a man untethered, consumed by a hunger that no battlefield victory could ever satisfy. And in that silence, after the drums of war, he unleashed a different kind of warfare, a war against moderation, restraint, and eventually sanity itself, pouring his staggering fortune into a lifestyle so blindingly extravagant that even the decadent nobility of medieval France stood aghast. He staged colossal pageants that swallowed entire towns, commissioning plays, like his epic retelling of the Siege of Orleans, with hundreds of actors, sumptuous costumes, and endless rivers of free wine and food, a spectacle that blurred the line between patriotic tribute and a grandiose shrine to his own legend, all while his personal retinue swelled to 200 men, clad in fabrics finer than royalty, marching beside him like an army of velvet and silk. Manuscripts illuminated with gold leaf choirs composed entirely of angelic-voiced boys, lavish banquets, and the relentless pursuit of beauty in art and flesh. Gilles spared no expense, driven perhaps by the ghosts of battle or by a restless spirit already drifting toward the obsessions that would brand him forever in dark history and true crime lore as a potential medieval serial killer. But it was the Chapel of the Holy Innocents rising in Gothic splendor under Gilles' command that would echo with the most sinister irony. For though it was dedicated to the memory of children slaughtered by King Herod, It would later become a haunting symbol of the children who vanished around Gilles' estates, fueling rumors that stained the banners of a hero with the crimson handprints of a monster. His spending spiraled beyond reason, forcing him to sell off castles and lands piece by piece, draining a fortune that once rivaled kings, until even the monarchy intervened, issuing decrees forbidding any further purchase of Gilles' property in a desperate attempt to preserve what remained of his inheritance. Yet no edict could restrain a man already unmoored, for Gilles always found ways to skirt the rules, weaving charm, nobility, and ruthless cunning into a web strong enough to shield him from consequences, at least for a time. But while his theaters dazzled audiences and his chapels rang with sacred music, the whispers beyond castle walls were growing louder, and soon those lavish gates that welcomed guests in silk and song would open for visitors who would never walk back out. A chilling transformation that unfurls in the next far darker chapter of this unraveling enigma. Beneath the towering ramparts and glittering spectacles of Gilles de Rais' castles, a darkness began seeping into the stones, whispering secrets that would one day explode into one of history's most chilling unsolved mysteries. For as the feasts roared and music soared through stained glass, peasant families in villages surrounding his estates began noticing a grim pattern that true crime investigators and dark history scholars still dissect to this day. Children who wandered toward the gates of Machecoul-Tifoges and Champtocé were simply vanishing, swallowed whole by walls built to protect noble blood and never returning to the arms of parents who searched in vain. At first, it was all too easy for the powerful to explain away these disappearances, because in the rigid social hierarchy of medieval France, noble households frequently absorbed young boys as pages or servants, lifting them from poverty into a life of service where contact with their families might naturally cease. Yet as the months turned into years and the count of missing children crept higher, the whispers turned into terrified murmurs. For it was no longer only the poorest villagers losing their sons, but apprentices, tradesmen's children, and the offspring of merchants whose small but respectable stations should have offered some protection from the insatiable gravity of a predator cloaked in titles and holy architecture. It became an open secret that some of Gilles' servants roamed villages actively recruiting children, promising work, fine clothes, or scraps from lavish tables, spinning tales that lured innocents into stone corridors from which there would be no escape, and witnesses would later swear under oath that they had seen Gilles' men discarding small corpses or carrying bundles shaped horribly like lifeless bodies out under cover of night acts that would one day cement Gilles de Rais' place in dark history as perhaps medieval Europe's first true serial killer. And yet, through those same years of vanishing children, Gilles de Rais remained untouchable. A man so deeply entrenched in the fabric of nobility, so protected by wealth and reputation, that even as the rumors grew more macabre, not a single authority dared challenge the Marshal of France, because in an age when peasants were disposable and noble blood was sacrosanct, who would dare accuse a war hero and lavish patron of the arts of such monstrous crimes? But as Gilles' coffers emptied and desperation took root, a new and even darker chapter began to write itself in blood and ritual, as he turned toward occult promises of hidden treasure and demonic pacts, a descent into forbidden arts and sacrificial horrors that waits to be revealed in the next twisted turn of this unspeakable tale. As the silver coffers of Gilles de Rais dwindled under the crushing weight of his extravagant pursuits and the relentless drain of his theatrical spectacles, a desperation took hold of the man who had once helped liberate France, driving him toward shadows darker than any battlefield he'd ever crossed. And it was in this void between fortune and ruin that he plunged headlong into the forbidden realms of occult rituals and demonic bargains, a chapter of dark history so drenched in true crime horror that even medieval chroniclers recoiled from setting every detail to parchment. With creditors closing in and his inheritance slipping through his fingers like blood through a wound, Gilles turned his gaze from the earthly glories of pageants and castles toward the promise of hidden treasure whispered to him by men who claimed to command the powers of the infernal, none more pivotal than the enigmatic Italian cleric named Francesco Prelati, who appeared in the narrative like a specter cloaked in Latin incantations and cryptic sigils. Prelati promised Gilles access to a demon called Baron, a being allegedly capable of revealing vast caches of gold and silver buried in secret places, but only if the rituals were performed precisely and if the offerings were sufficient. And here the story slithers into the realm of unspeakable terror for the demon's price. According to Prelati's grim instructions, demanded not mere coins or incense, but the most innocent blood imaginable, the hands, the hearts, the eyes, and the blood of children, gifts to be spilled upon altars in stone chambers reeking of tallow and fear. Whether Gilles truly believed in the supernatural, or whether he seized upon occult sacrifice as a convenient veil for his own monstrous appetites, remains one of the greatest unsolved mysteries swirling through the annals of medieval true crime. Yet the consequences were horrifyingly real for the disappearances of children, accelerated, transforming whispers into screams that no longer remained confined to peasant hovels. And as villagers began to speak of black masses, ritual circles, and hidden rooms within castle walls, the legend of Gilles de Rais, war hero turned occult predator, crystallized into one of history's most enduring shadows, a tale pulsing with conspiracy theories and the chilling echo of a medieval satanic panic. But even as these dark rites unfolded in secret, Gilles still managed to wear the mask of nobility in public, attending mass, hosting feasts, and holding court, all while the walls around him were closing in, and in the very next chapter, the mask would finally crack under the unbearable weight of testimony and confession, revealing horrors so graphic that even medieval court scribes could scarcely bear to record them in full. For nearly 8 years, the shadows clinging to Gilles de Rais' towering fortresses had grown longer and darker, cloaking secrets that even the most brazen whispers dared not name aloud. But as with all monsters hiding in plain sight, it was a single moment of reckless arrogance that finally tore open the gates of impunity, setting in motion one of the most sensational true crime trials ever recorded in medieval Europe, and forever carving Gilles' name into the blood-soaked annals of dark history. It was in May of 1440, amid simmering disputes over property and pride, that Gilles, perhaps drunk on the same volatility that had served him so well in war, chose to resolve a quarrel with a priest named Jean Le Ferron by storming into the sacred space of a church, abducting the cleric at sword point in front of horrified congregants, a violent desecration of sanctuary so egregious that even his noble titles could no longer shield him. Suddenly, the Bishop of Nantes and the Duke of Brittany, who for years had looked away as children vanished, found their pretext to strike, dispatching armed forces to the gates of Gilles' castle at Machecoul that September. Yet in an act as haunting as any battle charge, Gilles surrendered without resistance, as if the war hero who once faced English swords with fearless rage had grown exhausted by the weight of secrets festering behind his own walls. From that moment, 2 trials unfolded in a macabre dance of ecclesiastical authority and secular power, with one court seeking to brand Gilles a heretic for summoning demons, while the other pursued him for the far more human yet equally monstrous crimes of murder, sexual assault, and ritual slaughter. At first, Gilles spat defiance, mocking the judges, refusing to acknowledge the court's right to try a marshal of France, but when threatened with excommunication, a punishment that meant eternal damnation in the medieval mind, his bravado crumbled like mortar struck by a battering ram, and on October 15th, he stunned the courtroom by confessing, though at first he held back the darkest truths, denying the demonic pacts while admitting to certain unnamed grievous sins. Yet it was the mere threat of torture that finally wrenched open the full nightmare, for on October 20th, Gilles began a confession so graphic and soul-shattering that even the scribes tasked with recording his words sometimes paused their quills in horror. And it is in these chilling confessions detailing murders, dismemberments, and ritual atrocities that the true climax of this story begins spilling into the harrowing spectacle of medieval justice that would unfold in the next and perhaps most haunting chapter of this relentless descent into darkness. On the cold, gray morning of October 26, 1440, the city of Nantes awoke to the grim spectacle that would etch Gilles de Rais' name not only into the bloody ledger of medieval executions, but into the very marrow of true crime and dark history, for as crowds surged toward the meadow outside the city walls, drawn by morbid curiosity and the desperate need for closure, They came to witness the final chapter of a man who had once stood alongside Joan of Arc, and now stood condemned as perhaps medieval Europe's most monstrous serial killer. Draped in white, the color of repentance, Gilles emerged from the prison walls, his face a mask of dignity and sorrow, and whether it was genuine remorse or the performance of a seasoned nobleman, no one could say, but his voice carried over the hush of the crowd as he addressed the sea of faces, begging forgiveness for his sins and urging parents to raise their children, strictly blaming the abyss he had fallen into on the laxness of his upbringing and the poisonous influence of his grandfather, Jean de Craon. Even in these final moments, Gilles retained the bearing of a Marshal of France, requesting the privilege of dying first, so his loyal accomplices Henriette and Poitou might be spared the agony of watching his execution. And when the noose was slipped around his neck, he turned to them, bidding them die bravely and think only of salvation. A farewell that rippled through the crowd with a mix of horror, pity, and disbelief. The trapdoor fell, and with it, the life of a man who had once been France's glittering hope, now reduced to a cautionary legend whispered through centuries of true crime fascination and medieval conspiracy theories. And though the flames were lit beneath his body, the executioners honored Gilles' final request, cutting him down before the fire consumed him entirely, so that he might receive a Christian burial, a gesture of mercy starkly at odds with the monstrous deeds he had confessed. His body was carried to the monastery of Notre-Dame des Carmes, laid to rest under the shadows of holy walls, while his servants met their ends moments later, their corpses left to burn until reduced to ash, their memory forever entwined with one of the most unspeakable chapters in Europe's dark history. Yet as the smoke drifted into the skies over Nantes, carrying with it the scent of judgment and secrecy, the true question remained: had the flames consumed a monster or a man ensnared by a conspiracy so vast it could rewrite the chronicles of medieval justice, a question whose haunting echoes will draw us deeper into the swirling debate in the next chapter of this tangled, sinister mystery. Long after the ashes of Gilles de Rais were scattered to the winds over the fields of Nantes, the questions he left behind refused to die, swirling like restless spirits through the corridors of dark history and igniting fierce debates among true crime historians, conspiracy theorists, and legal scholars who cannot agree on whether the man once hailed as France's savior was truly a medieval serial killer or the tragic victim of one of the grandest political conspiracies ever orchestrated in the shadows of the medieval world. For while the confessions he offered in trembling detail were grotesque enough to sear themselves into legal records, descriptions of children hung on hooks of bloody rituals of heads kept as trophies, many point out that not a single body was discovered within his castles during the exhaustive investigations, a void of physical evidence that looms like a black hole at the center of this unsolved mystery. Critics of the conviction argue that Gilles' confession came only after threats of excommunication and torture, in a time when the mere specter of eternal damnation could shatter the resolve of even the bravest noblemen, and they highlight how accusations of child murder and dealings with the devil were convenient tools for eliminating powerful rivals, casting a veil of religious and moral horror over political machinations designed to seize land titles and wealth. Indeed, the Duke of Brittany, who led the charge against Gilles, stood to inherit vast swathes of Gilles' estates upon his execution, while the Bishop of Nantes, who prosecuted the ecclesiastical case, gained enormous influence, suggesting motives that might have been as tangled as any modern conspiracy. And then there was the astonishing moment in 1992, when a French court armed with modern legal standards and a fresh review of the centuries-old evidence declared Gilles de Rais not guilty, igniting fresh controversy and leaving true crime enthusiasts divided between those convinced he was Europe's first documented serial killer and those who see him as the ultimate casualty of medieval justice corrupted by greed and fear. Yet, even with the modern acquittal, the stain upon his name has never fully lifted, for the testimonies of his accomplices remain chillingly consistent, describing atrocities in matching gruesome detail that seems difficult to fabricate in perfect synchrony. And so the legend endures, a twisted tapestry of war heroism, unspeakable horror, and the eternal question of whether monstrous crimes were truly committed, or whether a man who once carried France's banner into battle was himself devoured by the same ruthless political forces he once served, a question that presses us to confront deeper truths about power, justice, and the fragile line separating fact from fear, a line we must examine closely in the final reflections that await in the concluding chapter of this haunting chronicle. So, we are left staring into the abyss, Gilles de Rais carved into history, torn between two violently clashing narratives that have kept true crime enthusiasts, dark history scholars, and conspiracy theorists locked in debate for centuries. Because whether he was a monstrous medieval serial killer who desecrated the sanctity of innocence with ritualistic slaughter and collected children's heads like twisted works of art, or a tragic pawn sacrificed on the bloody altar of medieval politics, one truth remains unshakable. His story exposes the fragile boundary between power and impunity, between the hero's mantle and the predator's grin, a boundary that still resonates today in modern headlines about the rich and powerful hiding horrors behind gilded facades. In Gilles, we see both the bright banners of Orléans fluttering above the battlefield beside Joan of Arc, and the unimaginable darkness that might have festered in secret chambers echoing with the cries of children, a dichotomy so stark it feels almost impossible to reconcile, and perhaps that is the reason his tale endures pulsing through the veins of true crime and unsolved mysteries, because it forces us to confront the horrifying possibility that the monsters we fear are not always lurking in shadows. They are sometimes standing in the light, draped in titles, commanding armies, and kneeling in chapels. They themselves built on foundations soaked in sin. Whether those castle walls ever truly witnessed the rivers of blood described in court, or whether they merely reflected the ambitions of men eager to seize Gilles' wealth and lands may never be proven, for medieval justice was a brutal theater where torture could extract confessions from the innocent, and where rumor and political convenience could devour even the most celebrated war heroes. Yet there is no escaping the haunting power of Gilles' own words, his trembling confession etched into records that still chill the blood, leaving us questioning whether a man who once helped save France could also have butchered its children in the most depraved ways imaginable. It is a tale that reminds us how easily truth and terror intertwine, how history itself can become a labyrinth where justice, power, and human darkness collide. And perhaps the real horror is not whether Gilles de Rais was guilty or innocent, but that in medieval France, or indeed in any age, a man could slaughter hundreds of children over 8 years before anyone in power dared to intervene, because poverty rendered some lives invisible and nobility made others untouchable, a chilling reality that should keep us questioning always. So tell me, do you believe Gilles de Rais was the monster of medieval legend or a casualty of conspiracy and fear? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you're drawn to the shadows where true crime meets dark history, make sure you're subscribed, because the next twisted chapter we uncover might be even darker than this one. In the end, perhaps the story of Gilles de Rais forces us to wrestle with a truth even more disturbing than severed heads on a mantelpiece or whispers of demonic pacts, because it leaves us staring into the unsettling mirror of human nature, realizing that power unchecked and shrouded in privilege can cloak monsters in shining armor, and that justice, especially in the tangled courts of medieval France, could just as easily consume the innocent as the guilty. It reminds us that history, like any true crime mystery, is rarely black or white, but seethes in shades of blood and shadow, and that sometimes the greatest terror is not knowing whether the monster was real or whether the real monster was the machinery of accusation and ambition itself. And so I ask you, which truth do you believe? Was Gilles de Rais the first medieval serial killer whose crimes stained stone walls red? Or was he a victim destroyed by conspiracies that rewrote history in the name of greed and power? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one, and your perspective might help unravel a mystery that's haunted the world for nearly 6 centuries. And if you crave the shadows where true crime collides with dark history, save this video, share it, and hit subscribe right now, because what's coming next might be even darker than you dare imagine.